Yes, welcome everyone. I'll just get started because we do have a bit of a tight agenda. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm very excited to engage this topic of equity in ocean litter and its governance with our panelists and viewers today. My name is, there we go. My name is Jessica Vandenberg. I am a postdoc at the University of Washington School of Marine and Environmental Affairs, and I'm also a fellow with the Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus Center. I will be co-chairing today's event with my colleague, Harriet Hardin Davies, who is a postdoc with the University of Wollongong and is also a fellow with the Ocean Nexus Center. This event was organized through the Ocean Nexus Center's Ocean Voices program. And this program's central goal is to advance equity through the UN Ocean Decade and ensure that strategies and governance frameworks developed through the decade allow for equity concerns to be integrated into their design. Some quick housekeeping. This event is recorded. To engage in the discussion today, we ask that you pose general questions or questions related to research presentations using the Q&A function and general comments in the chat function. And as attendees, I ask that we all be respectful and help maintain a safe and friendly space. During our panel discussions, we invite you to join using the Jamboard that we set up. The link should be posted into the chat. To add a comment or question, just click on the sticky note or text box icons. And there are also some pre-made notes posted onto the boards that you can directly add your comments to. There are 3 separate boards, 1 per question, to make sure that you are adding your comments or questions to the appropriate board. So for today's event, we're going to start off with a brief overview of our upcoming Ocean Litter and Equity Report that will be released early next year. This will be presented by Dr. Yoshi Oda, the director of Ocean Nexus Center and the lead author of this report. And our report was a major motivation for organizing today's event. All our panelists are contributing authors and will be presenting some of their major findings from their chapters. This will be followed by 2 panels. The first will be on impacts of ocean litter and the second will be on governance. Each panel will begin with a brief 5-minute presentation from each of the panelists, followed by discussion and questions. After both panels, we'll invite all panelists to participate in a discussion on how we can ensure equity can be integrated into responses to the ocean litter crisis. So I'd like to now invite Dr. Oda to join us and give an introduction to the project and our report.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. What I'd like to introduce is 2.5 years worth work with my colleagues, who's many of them are participating today's event to present their research on ocean litter or marine plastics, so-called. When I was asked by Nippon Foundation and then also started collaborating with my colleagues to study about ocean litter, the first question that we had was really, so what's the impact? And it's not only about the impact of, to marine ecosystem, but it's also the impact to human well-being. There's basically one big question: what's the impact? So hence our first panel is engaging with the impact, introduced by Juan Jose and Elaine Fasterman. Then second part of the question is, okay, how prepared are we to deal with this in terms of policies, governance, institutions, and the knowledge and the management system? And that's really came about in the second question. And so we ask to look at this in various places, also international platform, and much more closely to the local impact, how people are actually dealing with this issue. Then through these studies, about 2.5 years ago, with much of the work with Jessica Vandenberg and the colleagues who've been organizing this and leading this effort, we start talking about like, okay, what we are looking for is not really to consider the impact at the mass, or is not really consider the impact to the human well-being as a kind of like a large scale. It's not really how much ton is over there, how much work is being done, but it's really to understand, okay, who has been impacted and what is that we actually need to consider if we wanted to work to reduce those burden and impacts from particular ecosystem or particular sector and social groups of the people. So hence the question became much more equity around it. So those three questions are, what are the impacts of ocean litter, and then how are these impact inequitably experienced? And the second, what perpetuate these inequities? And the third, what are social equitable solutions for addressing ocean litter? So this is the whole theme of the report. And we're going to talk about first two questions, or potentially third questions, potentially asking you guys, what is your opinions and your thinking and your vision, and potentially we're missing somebody else in the conversation in this pursuit of looking for equitable solution of the ocean litter. Well, thank you very much again for coming to our event. And after those wonderful and very deep presentations, profound knowledge and understandings, we're hoping to engage you with a conversation, including all of us, to pursue this really difficult, but yet quite solvable issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Yoshi, for that. So I would like to now move on to our first panel and introduce everyone who will be presenting on the impacts of ocean litter and on the environment and society. Our first speaker, Dr. J.J. Alava, is from the University of British Columbia and will be talking about the problems and impacts of microplastic bioaccumulation. Our second speaker, Dr. Elaine Faustman from the University of Washington, will be discussing her work on impacts of marine litter on human well-being. And our final speaker, Ivy Akuoko Giyama from the University of Cape Coast, will present on her ethnographic work on impacts of marine litter in coastal communities of Ghana. All right, so I'll move to JJ, and I know that you need to share your screen, so I will stop sharing.
Thank you, yes, for the introduction, and I will proceed to share my screen to start our conversation. So everyone can see it at the moment. Sorry. Yeah, here we go. Okay. See. So our contribution basically is focused in this big problem that human beings have planet Earth, our blue planet, facing, and plastics is becoming one of the most pervasive and worst anthropogenic footprint that we have inflicted in our ocean and coastal areas. And to understand that, we need to be aware that this is part of a much bigger problem in the face of warming oceans and climate change in the Anthropocene. To understand the pervasive nature of this emerging contaminant, plastic and microplastic, we need to understand the multimedia environment. And in this first illustration, I just want to show you that different matrices of compartment that are basically sources and sinks, and like air, like water, like sediments, and of course, the marine organism, and also human that heavily depend in some of these seafoods and marine species for subsistence and to provide economic for many coastal communities. It's well known that large plastic, microplastic basically impact many species like top predator and charismatic species. And we know that as a problem, it's becoming a chronic problem. And it's in our hand basically to understand how these contaminants accumulate in addition to the toxicity and persistence. So to understand the accumulation behavior, because we need to understand first whether this plastic particle accumulate in order to cause toxicity, we need to basically come with ideas, with conceptual model, and then application of modeling tools based on mathematical approaches to see whether these contaminants really are accumulated or eliminated. And that's important because basically the net accumulation of microplastic in organisms is a function of the intake, ingestion, minus the elimination. That part that remains in the compartment that can be an organism is called accumulation. And elimination is important because that can be species specific or food web specific. And we demonstrate that with our development of model and the application of the EcoPath and ecosystem modeling, that some species accumulate more than others, and not necessarily need to be the top predator in the system, like I am showing here with killer whales and Chinook salmon, which is the main prey of killer whales, southern resident killer whales, for example, in the northeastern Pacific. You understand that this overall approach, we know that although they accumulate, in some cases, in some food web, top predators are exhibiting the highest concentration, but in some cases, the prey also can show. And that depends pretty much in the elimination rate. Remember, that has the driving force accumulation of plastics. And we basically provide that contribution in one of our publications. Now that we understood how this contaminant make all the way through the food web, how they are distributed in the environment, you understand the fate, we wanted to go a little bit beyond. You understand what is the global footprint of microplastics in the world, in the global ocean. And to do that, basically, we come together with the help of colleagues like Melanie Berman and Mainu from the Alfred Wegener Institute to provide the global database in the distribution of microplastic in the global ocean, and also with the support of our colleague Marcia Moreno-Baez from Tufts University, who provide the geospatial statistical analysis to try to portray the global footprint and the global ocean. And in this map here, basically, I am showing the areas of high concentration of density of microplastic and nanoplastic in the world. And this is based on what is available in the literature. Of course, there is some gaps, like in the white spaces that you see in the map. Overlapping is the oceanographic currents in the world. The red one are the warm current and the blue one are the cold currents. So this is important to see that basically in the Pacific, we have hotspot of accumulation of density, high density of microplastic. Also in the North Atlantic, we see a high accumulation and high density of concentration of microplastic. Not surprising, the Peninsula Antarctica is also one of the hotspots. And so is the Asia and some part of West and East Africa. And of course, the Arctic is not immune to this global footprint. Now, but what is the purpose of doing this? What was the purpose to contribute with this part? Well, our next contribution was really to say, okay, what does this mean in terms of the impact to coastal communities and the world? And to understand that, basically, we put together basically litter-based, we put together the geospatial analysis, and we use the consumption rate of coastal communities around the global ocean, based in the paper by Andres Cisnero Montemayor. We try to come with this preliminary microplastic potential exposure index to see what are the communities, the coastal communities of peoples that are basically most exposed to the global footprint. And basically we found that, for example, in Southeastern Asia, like Cambodia, Thailand, there are a high NPE index. And also in some Caribbean areas, like in Dominica, also the index of exposure is high. Keep in mind that this is no risk. This is just how exposed are the community. To understand that the risk in human, we need to understand what are the health effects, the endpoint that are affected. And I am sure Elaine will provide us and highlight this important aspect. And the Arctic also is not immune, the Arctic communities are not immune also to the exposure of microplastics. So with that, I just want to leave you there and continue with the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, JJ. All right, so we will now move to Elaine's presentation on well-being. And let me just quickly reshare my screen.
Oh, are you going to show it, the two slides? Oh, fantastic. Okay, that's great. That's wonderful. So again, thank you, JJ and Yoshi, for setting this stage. I'm very pleased to be here. As was mentioned, I'm part of the Ocean Litter Project, and I come from the School of Public Health. So as JJ alluded to, the idea that we're very interested in what the public health impacts are and what this means in this context of equity. So the next slide is the single slide really that I'm going to use. And what this does is to start to lay the context for how we think about things as public health scientists. So the input to the oceans, as JJ also showed so very nice, is approximately 8 million metric tons of plastic into the ocean each year. One of the things about this is that there's a complexity to the plastic and the types of plastics. We don't want to understate the idea that there are multiple forms of plastics, and at least 3 large size bins that we look at, from the idea of macroplastics, where we have very large things. This is the commonly viewed impacts that you see, where the plastic bags are within the stomach of mammals, and this is the plastic that surrounds the bottlenose dolphins that you see. What JJ was talking about then was microplastics and the extent of where these are being identified around the world, and the disproportionate distribution of these then in these island communities and smaller and ocean dependent communities. And for me, what does that mean for the families and the children and the livelihoods for individuals in these areas? So the other thing before I leave size is, one of the more recent findings is the idea of the potential of nanoparticle plastics. And one of the challenges with this is that the methodologies that we use to look for microplastics do not include the size and characterization of the nanoplastics, which from terrestrial studies suggest and airborne studies suggest are the ones that are of the greatest potential for human health impact. But one of the things that, as a public health scientist, that we think about, which is very distinct from medical sciences, is that we're not so interested in treating diseases or even cataloging diseases, but we want to prevent disease or illness or adverse health effects. And I think for us, the marine litter problem really exemplifies this challenge, and how do we provide an equity context in this. I chose just a few slides here to illustrate this idea and what we mean by inequity in the solutions that have thus far been proposed. In the bottom right, we see a marine station that's located in one of the Indonesian islands, from the Spremode Islands, and this is Barang Lompo. This is a community of approximately 5,000 individuals, and it only has 21 hectares. You can imagine what this kind of litter problem means for a community of this size without adequate waste and waste management infrastructure on this island, as well as the neighboring islands on this. Another illustration is shown just directly above that, with a series of Indian fishermen sorting their catch at Kolam Beach in Kerala. And in this, since 2017, they alone have collected 80 tons of plastics from the sea, overwhelming their resources and their context. On the upper side, then you see then some very entrepreneurial young children collecting marine waste for selling. None of these solutions and challenges are adequately looked at. And the psychological factors, as well as the potential human health impacts, are not adequately addressed in our current risk assessment profiles on this. So what we did to center these narratives was to develop a well-being survey and framework for this. So what factors actually contribute to one's sense of well-being in a community? Our connections to nature and community are disrupted under these kinds of conditions that you see in very small view of what's going on. We need to understand and develop tools to evaluate the impact on mental health, social relationships, food security, identity, housing. and our cultural impacts in this. So to do that, we've developed this survey tool as part of the Marine Litter Project. And what you're going to see in the next presentation after mine from Ivy is the application of that survey. So again, Ivy, I'm going to leave it to you to some of the details on this, but just realize that we have to broaden our frame for understanding impact to be able to address this and provide equitably based solutions. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop here now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elena. And that was a wonderful segue into Ivy's talk. Let me move the slide. So take it away, Ivy. Ivy, are you there?
Sorry, Jess, I'm here.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. It's nice meeting you all once again, and I'm glad to be part of this big group because I'm ready to learn a lot from you guys. So, taking on from where Dr. Firstman ended. So this, the Marine Litter Survey was conducted in Elmina and Tema Newtown in Ghana, but this particular presentation is on Elmina because this is also in conjunction with the case study that I did for the Ocean Litter report. So using literature and also surveys, Elmina was studied for waste management and marine litter to be precise, and its impact on the people and their well-being. So Elmina is a very vibrant fishing community in Ghana. Aside its economic benefits that it gets from the marine environment, it also has some spiritual attachment to it, particularly to the Benya Lagoon, because it has a history, they are attached to it historically based on the person who settled there first and founded that community. As we all know, plastics have made life easier for almost everyone all over the world, but when it comes to developing countries and especially coastal communities in Ghana, managing plastic is a huge problem. So now plastics have become more of a curse than a blessing that it should probably have been. So when you come to Elmina as a low-income community, just as every other low-income community in Ghana, communal waste collection system is the basic waste collection system that they use. Unfortunately, these are characterized by no segregation and less recycling. Recycling is just done by some informal waste pickers who just go around or sit somewhere for people to bring these plastics from their homes, and then they transport it to wherever they want to transport it to for recycling. Waste not sent to communal containers are either dumped on wetlands, and wetlands because they usually want to claim their land for building. Because the community, most parts of the community is already settled in a wetland, and because these lands are not suitable for building, they tend to use this waste as a material to fill the land so that they can build on it. Others also dump in drains because they are far away from the communal collection points. When it comes to solid waste management in general, there has been some efforts by the government to kind of solve the problem by distributing dustbins and all that, but there hasn't been a very, very concerted effort to tackle marine litter. Just aside we signing on to conventions and treaties, there hasn't been a very practical measure to solve this problem. Reasons for the challenges with waste management in Elmina has to do with inadequate infrastructure, the attitude of the people not so strong enough to overcome the barriers that surround them when it comes to waste management, and also the lack of law enforcement. So like it has been mentioned by JJ and Ellen, the impacts of waste is enormous on the people, especially their well-being. The survey shows that most of the people in the past used to fish in the lagoon and all that, but now they are not able to do that because it's covered with waste. Their livelihoods, especially fishing, is being affected by marine litter. And a news item reveals that the fishermen in Elmina were calling the government of Ghana to buy plastics because they were complaining they were fishing more plastics than fish. But unfortunately for them, the government of Ghana is not ready to do that now, maybe sometime in the future. But these people are acknowledging the fact that they are actually perpetrators and they are also victims because they have inadequate waste management infrastructure. So they contribute to the problem, but other problems created elsewhere is carried to their shores due to the movement of the waves. So they are actually hoping that something can be done about it. In terms of health effects, literature reviews that cholera and malaria, dysentery are some of the common diseases that you find within the Elmina community, and salt mined in that area has been identified to contain some metal pollutants, which again translates into health effects of anyone who eats this salt or uses it for any other purpose. So in conclusion, the people of Elmina are aware that marine litter is a big problem. They appreciate the fact that they are contributors to the problem, and they're actually wishing and hoping that there could be an improved waste management system for them to actually mitigate the situation. And I hope that, and I know that with improved infrastructure in law enforcement, this menace, if not even eliminated at all, could be reduced. One thing that can actually also help with getting more information on this, just like the survey did, is to actually gather more data when it comes to the impact of marine litter on the people. Because we are talking about the impacts. Survey, we just talk about, but we have not been able to quantify it economically, especially for people to really appreciate it in numbers. Because people appreciate numbers than abstract. Okay, so I feel like I am not okay because there's money. But when you tell them that, you are losing this amount of money because of this issue, people kind of tend to appreciate it more than doing abstract things. So this is what I found in both the literature review and the survey that I conducted in Elmina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivy. I'm going to now move it to our panel question, and just first reflecting on everyone's talk. I think you're all talking to some extent about the potential inequities that are linked to either ecological or social impacts. JJ, you speak about this distribution of exposure, which is really critical for us to further understand, and then connecting that into what Elaine and Ivy are talking about of how inadequate governance systems are these barriers to mitigating these problems and preventing impacts. But if you could please expand on how you're directly connecting impacts to the inequitable experience, that would be helpful. And JJ, could you start us off, please?
There is like a background probably noise, but okay. Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think when we try to address this question, it's important to think that indeed there is inequality, and I think the focus to start formulating the responses first to think who are the one that causing the plastic pollution issue, who are the one really generating the problem, and who are the one that experiences or who are the recipients of the impacts and consequences of ocean pollution by plastics, and who can fix it and provide solutions along with those who have the political will to make the decisions and a call for action to really diverge from a plastic dependence economy and provide a more proactive life cycle assessment. In reality, the people exhibiting the high consumption rates of plastic stemming from a pervasive plastic demand and those who supply it disproportionately really affect the success and failure of plastic pollution mitigation and solution for minority groups and the most exposed coastal communities. And if we want to really start taking action, I think remember that most of the marine litter and plastic pollution is land-based. And we need to look at the institutions, the policies and management system that perpetuates these inequities. So who exacerbated? While there is efforts around the world, the new UNEP report is clear that human beings, the oceans, the economy, the world is being impacted. The amount of volume is gonna triple by 2040. Still, there are much actions to put in place to try to really mitigate and tackle the problem. And if we wanna really see where the inequities start with these land-based sources, I think we need to really combat the single-use plastic industries, the clothing, textile, apparel industries, the automotive, the electronics, electrics, basically all the transitions that we might recommend at the industrial level to try to really take into consideration the societies and communities that are basically affected. But at the same time, thinking that sometimes the impacts of plastic might be positive for some people that depend in the collection, recycling of plastics. In Ecuador, in many developing countries, there is people that basically have a life collecting this and exchange for money. And that is generational. It's from parents to children, and children have learned basically to become scavengers of plastics in some of these countries. So there are basically a lot of negative impacts, but at the same time, plastic has become a way of life for many people. Why don't we teach fishers to become fishers of plastics to help to clean certain areas instead of fishing fish? Just an idea why we don't promote the incentives to these communities to create a framework that really take into consideration the most affected communities around the global ocean and coastal areas.
No, thank you. I think you raised this important point that it's very complex. There's different winners and losers regardless of which direction we go in. And you also hit on this one really major part, which is like this distributional aspect of distributional equity aspect of marine plastics, which is really important. Elaine, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think building on what JJ talked about and you referred to as this distributional inequity and exposures, I want to talk a little bit more about the impact part of that, because, when we're talking about exposure and then moving it into risk, the idea is what is the hazard of that disproportionate exposure, but it's also dependent on the cultural and community context. So these are impacting individuals that are very dependent on these food sources. So the idea that they may have other underlying conditions and the dependency on these food sources that are being taken away, it's more than just the impact there, but if it's affecting the quality, quantity, and sustainability of those food sources in these communities that are so dependent, that adds another complexity. So that's why we move to the well-being context to look at this. I do differ just a little bit from JJ on this issue of having the people that are impacted by someone else's produced litter. I worry a bit about these children collecting waste for money, and even families collecting waste for monies, because what that does is causes some psychological differences. And in the well-being context, we've been hearing from people that it's degrading to move from someone who is providing food and fish and a very wonderful source of food to all of a sudden then being tainted by having to collect the litter along with that. And there's some demoralization associated with that. So that's one of the reasons why I think that there's complexity of impacts here, and that the equitable solutions need to be matched with this broader context of well-being and impact. So I think that, these discussions are so essential in understanding this. And I think Ivy's surveys that she referred to, this idea of the cultural impact of this plastic there impacts the cultural significance of the relationships with the oceans. So yes.
Would you like to expand on that aspect?
Yes.
Jess, were you talking to me, please?
Oh, yes. Just what Elaine was mentioning regarding the cultural context and how marine plastics play into that.
Yeah, so interestingly, that is what Ellen said is what is expected, that if a community has a spiritual attachment to the coastal environment and it is that polluted, then you expect that there should be that kind of disassociation, because whatever they have spiritually is polluted. But interestingly, my people here, we are not experiencing that kind of effect. And I don't know whether it is because they have to do their spiritual practices regardless, or this pollution has no effect on their spiritual attachment, because they have not stopped pouring libation into the lagoon, going there every year to sacrifice whatever they have to do to their gods, despite how heavily polluted the environment is. So maybe that is something that probably will need further studies to really ascertain why a community that claims to be spiritually attached to an environment sits there for the environment to be degraded, and yet still goes there to have that spiritual connection with the environment. I think it's very debatable and needs further investigation to really ascertain why that is happening. But like what Ellen said, should have been the case, but that is not happening. So I don't know, Ellen, do you have any idea why this could be the case?
Yes, I think there's different types of cultural practice. I mean, we have heard from other contamination issues that people from more indigenous populations within the US, that it contaminates and they lose the spiritual value of that interaction. But in other cases in Japan, we have heard anecdotal reports from individuals, in particular women, that are involved in food supplying, to change to litter collection is demeaning them in their job responsibility. So, you know, culture includes a lot of different aspects. And I think what you're seeing is that different ways, and this is why the importance of the way that we ask the question and what the context is, to capture these nuances and understanding on this.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I
They
agree.
differ a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this just drives the point home that the local context and the cultural context of where these problems happen are really paramount. We need to be cognitive of how these problems manifest within different situations, and that needs to be integrated better into the way that governance is designed. I think I'm just going to wrap it up there with this conversation. We have to move on to the next group, but that was really interesting, insightful, and I think we can kind of come back to some of these topics with our final discussion question. So at this point, I would like to hand it over to Harriet to introduce the next group and move on to the next topic of governance.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vandenberg, and thank you so much to all the first panelists. That was an absolutely fantastic panel, and very, very serious issues that we will continue to explore in this, our second panel. It's my pleasure to introduce the panelists who will give the 4 contributions in this panel today, which we're going to be exploring some of the governance aspects around understanding and perhaps tackling the inequitable impacts of ocean litter. So first today, we'll hear from Dr. Elizabeth Mendenhall from University of Rhode Island. Then we'll hear from Dr. Jess Vandenberg, who you've already met this morning, from the University of Washington. We'll then hear from Dr. Eliza Morgera, the director of One Ocean Hub. And then finally, we have a contribution from Drs. Trizia Ferrelli, Matt Perryman, and Romilly Cumming from Massey University. So with that, I'd like to please invite Dr. Mendenhall to give us 5 minutes of perspectives on ocean governance regimes. Thank you, Dr. Mendenhall.
Thank you, Harriet. I'm going to start my timer, keep myself to 5 minutes. So my PhD is in international relations, and my research focus is the progressive development of the ocean governance regime, especially the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. And I'm in a Department of Marine Affairs, so I'm surrounded by other folks who focus on ocean governance. And I got into this topic initially when I started this job, just with a basic question. It was hard for me to understand why we have such a well-entrenched, highly praised framework convention for ocean governance in UNCLOS. But at the same time, we have this massive problem of marine plastic pollution that seems to be getting worse. The problem is growing rather than the solutions growing from my perspective. So I wanted to investigate how UNCLOS as a framework convention either sets us up well or sets us up poorly for redressing this problem of marine plastic pollution. So my role in this project has two parts. The first chapter that I've drafted is about the international governance sort of stage for marine plastic debris. So what do we have in terms of international agreements to confront this issue? And the second chapter, which is sort of summarized a bit in this slide, is what are the legal and conceptual resources in UNCLOS that can be drawn upon to better address this problem. So I found that the framework provided by UNCLOS does include a very innovative Part 12 that includes obligations around preservation and protection of the marine environment. And it includes direct obligations for member states to reduce, prevent, and control land-based pollution. And they must take all necessary measures to do so. So it's very high on the level of obligation, but the precision in terms of what specifically states have to do is quite low. And there's very little delegation to any third party to have an oversight authority or a kind of authority to coordinate between states. States just have this obligation to cooperate with one another over problems like land-based pollution. So UNCLOS creates the framework, and all these subsequent agreements kind of fill in within that framework. Most of the activity there is focused on sea-based sources of pollution, including plastics. But as we know, it's typically understood that 80% of plastics that are in the ocean come from land-based sources. And UNCLOS sets us up with some resources, but one of its main issues is fragmentation. There's strong fragmentation between land and sea-based issues in terms of where the causes are, and also fragmentation of jurisdiction between port, coastal, and flag states. And so states have met some of their obligations under UNCLOS with regard to cooperating to redress land-based pollution, but we see a primacy of soft law instruments, voluntary agreements that are often include obligations or commitments that aren't well reported, aren't well monitored, that just really aren't shaping state behavior in the way that we would like. So this chapter reviews 3 different areas of UNCLOS that I think provide resources that could be drawn upon to better activate those existing obligations, which would require leadership from motivated and focused states. One of these is the Common Heritage of Mankind principle, which was sort of initiated and embraced by the international community in the 60s and the 70s. And most of the focus is on seabed mining as being managed by this new organization that was created to manage seabed activities that would do so with the idea of benefiting the international community as a whole. But Common Heritage, in its initial formulation as a principle, it was also about stewardship of the seabed as a whole, rather than just managing the industry of seabed mining. And the Seabed Authority is obligated to do things like promote scientific research, protect cultural heritage, to protect the marine environment. And so I think there's a lot of concepts here that can be drawn upon to push the ISA in different directions to do complementary activities in terms of our understanding of and response to plastic pollution, much of which ends up on the seafloor. Second is the dispute settlement mechanism. Very innovative part of UNCLOS includes 3 or 4 different options in terms of bringing parties to bringing cases against other state parties. In the area of marine pollution, it is compulsory, technically, and there are sort of ways around that. But when it comes to marine pollution, it's really been underutilized and has not at all been utilized by one state to bring another state a case against that state for not meeting its obligations in terms of land-based pollution. So there's sort of some jurisprudence to build on there. There is theoretically capability for states to activate this part of the agreement relative to one another. I'm out of time, but just number 3, UNCLOS has been modified twice in a substantial way in the mid-1990s, and we're investing in a 3rd effort to modify it, to augment UNCLOS rather, in the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction negotiations. These negotiations have not touched upon marine plastic pollution. They do include environmental focused mechanisms associated with environmental impact assessments and marine protected areas. But this is maybe an opportunity to craft an agreement that provides additional legal and conceptual resources that can be mobilized towards the plastic pollution issue. I know that was fast and vague, and I apologize, but 5 minutes is tough. So I'll cede the floor now, and maybe we can come back and say more in the questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Beth Mendenhall. I'd now like to invite Dr. Jess Vandenberg to share her perspectives on the role of industry in this challenge. And just a quick reminder to participants, if you'd like to engage in discussion using the Jamboard or pose questions in the chat function, we'll do our best to get there during the Q&A and discussion. Thank you. Dr. Vandenberg, please take it away.
Thank you, Harriet. My slide's actually next. Okay, so yeah, my chapter focused on industry actors and as governance actors in the space of plastic waste governance. I'm going to provide a quick summary of my chapter, and I'm going to focus on the motivations for exploring this form of governance, why I focus on a particular industry actor, and some of my findings. Multinational corporations involved in the fast-moving consumer goods sector have become active in marine litter and plastic waste governance, mainly through corporate social responsibility programs where they've set ambitious goals and initiatives to address the problem. On one end, the capacity of multinational corporations to drive change transnationally is an opportunity to implement the critical transformations necessary to address the plastics problem. But on the other hand, their interest in the accumulation of capital is in obvious conflict with the approaches required to equitably solve it. One of the major challenges is that CSR actions are largely implemented on a voluntary basis, lacking the regulatory mechanisms that may keep them accountable. Secondly, there are potential harms to this influence, especially in global South nations, where corporate-led actions have been criticized as ones that drain national sovereignty and allow for ongoing exploitation, accumulation, dispossession, and uneven development. In this chapter, I analyze how industry talks about the problem and the solutions, and I focus on the discourse because dominant discourses can impact the way society perceives environmental problems and the solutions to address them. I use the Coca-Cola Company as a case study mainly for two reasons. Firstly, they are the biggest polluter of marine plastic debris. According to an annual global audit of plastic marine debris, Coca-Cola has ranked as the #1 contributor since the audits began in 2018. And second, they have also set the most ambitious waste reduction goals through a program called World Without Waste. It's been a very public global initiative, and through its partnerships, Coca-Cola has impacted governance actions taken by various nations. The main finding is a consistent use of discourses that delay action. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, this discourse parallels those employed by industry and government to delay climate action. This is discussed by Lam et al. 2020. These discourses push incremental solutions that shy away from approaches that may threaten existing power structures and practices. They leverage narrow definitions of success, positive framing, and entrepreneurial values above transformative efforts and binding standards. But I also argue that these discursive tools are not only employed to slow down or derail necessary action, but also mask the inequities experienced by those most burdened by plastic waste and its management. One form of delay discourse that is used frequently in the campaign is a strategy that redirects responsibility. It individualizes the problems and the solutions, and it emphasizes the roles and responsibilities of the individual consumer while diverting attention from industry. An example of this was the EU-based campaign, Don't Buy Coca-Cola If You're Not Going to Help Us Recycle. This displaces responsibility of plastic waste issues onto the individual consumer by centering environmental citizenship as critical for product consumption, thus hiding the uneven relations between consumer and industry. Individualizing the problem can erase power dynamics, thus homogenizing responsibility across all actors, while ignoring how race, class, gender, and other factors may influence responsibility and vulnerability. I also discussed the notion of rhetorics of uneven representation, expanding on work developed by Paige West. This notion argues that there are deeply socially embedded rhetorics of representation that underlie all uneven development. In this case, there was a clear discord between how corporate higher-ups and local stakeholders are portrayed. In this image under the subheadings of rhetorics of representation on the left, this is a portrait of Casper Durant, head of sustainable packaging and agriculture of Coca-Cola Southern and Eastern Africa. The picture just to the right shows a smiling, nameless Black woman seemingly happily working at one of the recycling facilities that Coca-Cola has helped to set up in Kenya. This was a clear pattern of representation: anonymous Black and brown local stakeholders versus watercolor vignettes of white corporate actors. This lack of representation occurred both through anonymous imagery, but also through the absence of stakeholder voices throughout the reports, showing a lack of interest on Coca-Cola's part to integrate different perspectives into their vision of a world without waste. This uneven representation also has implications for legitimacy, as legitimacy is created through dominant actors and institutions, and this lack of dialogue implies structural inequalities within the system. What's more, the photograph on the right was taken at a recycling facility that Coca-Cola showcases as a success story of fostering plastic recycling economies and creating new livelihoods, but has been reported for having deplorable working conditions and paying unlivable wages. And claims like these raise concerns of accountability. In some, the World Without Waste initiative is reflective of a delayed action discourse where responsibility is redirected towards individuals, and the responses to the waste crisis indicates non-transformations. Moreover, there are clear concerns of equity, a lack of representation of stakeholders and so-called partners, and language that veils unequal burdens of plastic waste. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jess Vandenberg, for that fantastic presentation. I'd now like to invite Dr. Eliza Morguera, please share your screen, I believe, and share your thoughts on human rights and ocean plastic. Thank you, Dr. Morguera. Forgive me, I'm not hearing you right now.
Oh, sorry, forgot to unmute. I thought I had everything, but clearly.
That's great, thank you.
Thank you so much. So yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute to this great panel and bring to you some of the early findings from work that I'm doing also with colleagues from across the marine and social sciences in the One Ocean Hub, including in Ghana, South Africa, and the UK. As Elizabeth mentioned, we have opportunities under the law of the sea and ocean governance to address ocean plastics, but we have question marks remaining about how to do it and opportunities in ongoing international negotiations. The CBD and chemicals and waste agreements have also addressed this to some extent, but I think we remain to really connect those efforts and making sure there's no gaps. Just recently, last week in Glasgow, we had a new commitment within the climate change regime to address ocean-based solutions. And if we think about how plastic is produced together with fossil fuels, commitments to climate mitigation, and maybe also commitments to climate adaptation can be important parts of our solution to ocean plastics. Again, work to be done there. And including in the context of the end decade for ecosystem restorations. And opportunities are there also in the context of fisheries instruments and governance and freshwaters, as these are some of the sources of ocean plastics. But what I would like to do with this presentation is rather think about an additional part of international governance, which is not yet fully integrated with ocean governance and these other environmental efforts, and yet I think provides huge advantages for us to think in a more connected, interconnected way about equity and sustainable solutions for ocean plastics. And I would very much recommend reading a recent report by the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights on the life cycle of plastics, where we use human rights obligations and standards to understand where we have real solutions and when some of the solutions offered and discussed at length are unacceptable. They're false and can't be really do the work that we're hoping either for the health of the ocean, or for those bearing the brunt of the negative impacts of ocean plastics on their life, health, culture, human rights impacted by poverty, and particularly those groups that feel those impacts the most. And so I think what I would like to share from this is thinking as a collective of researchers and also colleagues involved in governance about how we can use and understand human rights standards. First of all, for the purposes of enhancing public participation, including right holders' participations, and that include indigenous peoples, indigenous knowledge holders and local knowledge holders, but also children who will be the ones bearing these impacts the longest in their lifetime in our decisions on ocean plastics across all these international fora that you have there on the slide. But also thinking about how human rights standards can help us to think across all those equity challenges. It was really interesting to hear earlier on the proposals from JJ and the comments from Elaine and Ivy about the mental and physical health issues, but also culture and spiritual attachments. And if we think about the indivisibility of SDGs and the indivisibility of human rights, that's a frame for us to look at all the options and really making sure we fully understand what potential equity impacts there might be and what solutions we can find. Also, it was really fascinating to hear about Jessie's research. And certainly, again, from a human rights perspective, we've made advances in holding corporations and other businesses accountable. We have standards and certain processes, and they can help to make, I think, having a harder legal approach to assessing the contribution of business, to clarifying their responsibility against international standards, the benefit both a healthier ocean and the human rights of those most affected by ocean plastics. And finally, I think that the last point I would like to explore is that in understanding human rights and how ocean plastics affect human rights, both in terms of affecting the health of the ocean, affecting marine biodiversity and all the ecosystems services that are essential for our human well-being, how ocean plastics negatively impacts on the capacity of the ocean to contribute to climate change mitigation, and that again cascades with negative impacts that are very well documented and very well understood, the human rights impacts of climate change, which we now see appearing more and more in climate change litigation across the world. So all of that we can use then as researchers and about thinking about the role of the UN Decade for Ocean Science in contributing to that understanding of these multiple equity issues, but also using that understanding for directing our research from the marine to the social sciences, laws, humanities, and art into the co-development of solutions to ocean plastics. And so again, using international human rights standards to think about genuine participation of human rights holders, and I stress particularly children, in the development of an integrated evidence base where we bring together the understanding of how the ocean is affected, ocean health, but also human health, culture, food, and particular groups. And we co-develop solutions where we can build on that lived experience of the impacts of ocean plastics, the unique knowledge and different forms of knowledge that academics and non-academics have, and come together to work and think about how we can connect those efforts that are currently disparate and have quite a few gaps across the puzzle, the international ocean governance and related aspects of international governance represent at the moment. So I'll stop there and hope that maybe I'll have a chance to go a bit deeper with the questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Eliza Morguera, for those comments. And our final contribution today comes from Matt Perryman and Romilly Cumming, giving some perspectives on waste colonialism. I think your slides are coming up shortly.
Sorry, did you want us to share the slide? Oh, cool.
Here we go. Should be here. Thank you so much, Matt. Over to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, guys. Kia ora tātou katoa. Our names are Matt Perryman and Romilly Cumming, and we're from Aotearoa, New Zealand, where it is currently 5:30 a.m. and the sun is rising. We're two student researchers on a team of 6. That also includes our supervisors, Tina Ngata, Sasha Fuller, Stephanie Burrell, and Tricia Farrelly, who is in the audience with us today. Our research seeks to understand how plastic pollution as a form of waste colonialism resonates here in Aotearoa. To achieve this, we interviewed experts, leaders, and advocates in the fields of waste mitigation and management, plastic pollution research and response, and Indigenous rights. Now, waste colonialism is most widely understood as the movement of waste from high GDP to low GDP countries. In other words, from the global north to the global south. As many of you will know, these processes are embedded in international waste management treaties that reinforce harmful power dynamics, especially between well-resourced colonial governments and often marginalized Indigenous communities. We approached our study with a distinct Aotearoa New Zealand cultural lens, exploring plastic pollution as waste colonialism from our unique geographic, political, economic, cultural, and historical viewpoints. Looking at waste colonialism in this way helped us to understand plastic pollution as it relates to sovereignty here in Aotearoa New Zealand, specifically the right to a safe, clean, and regenerative natural environment, and cultural, biological, and corporeal sovereignty. Framing plastics pollution as a form of waste colonialism revealed interconnections between New Zealand's political and economic systems that first developed during colonisation, and highlighted the varying levels of impact that plastic pollution has on our diverse communities here in Aotearoa. Now over to Romilly for our research findings.
Thanks, Matt. Kia ora, everyone. What we found was that capitalist economies are extractive, linear, and waste-producing by design, and they perpetuate harmful colonial ideologies that result in the endangerment of our natural environments and the health of our communities, as we've heard from other panelists this morning. Our time. Corporate imperialism, that is when corporations use their significant political influence to sway policy, prevent regulation, and maintain wasteful systems that produce plastic and other forms of pollution, is a system that ultimately harms everybody. Corporations, such as those that extract oil and mass produce plastics, are rewarded for maximising profits, which they do by externalising mounting environmental and human costs, rather than being forced to account for these internally. This affords corporations immense political influence, which is wielded to buoy harmful policy that supports their agendas. Secondly, no one in New Zealand is immune from the harmful impacts of plastics pollution, but using a waste colonialism lens highlighted the disproportionate harm that is experienced by the Indigenous people of Aotearoa, Māori, Pacifica peoples, those living subsistence lifestyles, and low socioeconomic and otherwise marginalised communities. For Māori, the harm caused by plastic pollution is just one example in a long line of environmental and social injustices wrought by the colonial agenda. But because of the ubiquitous and pervasive nature of plastic, it harms in nuanced ways. As oceanic people, 70% of the protein intake of coastal Māori communities comes from seafood, where fish consumption is 4 times the global average per capita. Seafood now has harmful levels of toxic plastic and chemical content, thus exposing these communities to increased health risks via ingestion, the full impacts of which we are yet to understand. Now, Māori culture is embedded in human-environment relationality with a strong emphasis on the shared genealogical and ecological connections of all things. This ontological relationality means that for Māori, the ocean is a food source, an ancestor, a god, and a source of healing, which led us to conclude that Indigenous oceanic peoples, such as Māori and Pacifica, experience marine plastic pollution in cultural, spiritual, and physical ways that non-Indigenous people do not. Many of our participants noted the irony and inequality associated with the inherent responsibilities of Māori to act as kaitiaki, or guardians, of Aotearoa New Zealand's natural environments, whilst one, being forcibly assimilated into the colonial and capitalist culture that drives plastic pollution, and 2, being obstructed by biased political system that inhibits Māori from introducing or leading alternative ways of environmental and waste management. The exclusivity of New Zealand's colonial legal system, which is embedded within ontological binaries that separate human from nature, was cited by our participants that we interviewed as exemplifying the government's lack of consideration and respect for the value of mataranga, which is Māori knowledge, and te ao Māori, Māori worldviews, in addressing environmental challenges. So we advocate for increased Indigenous representation at all levels of governance, but more on this in the panel discussion. Kia ora, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matt Perryman and Romilly Cumming, for joining us, providing that presentation and sharing with us the vision of that dawn. Thank you for the early hour that you've joined us with. We now have 10 minutes for discussion. So I'd like to invite all of the panelists to please join us with their videos if you're able to, and also to invite Dr. Trizia Forelli to also join this discussion if you'd like to. Forgive me, let me clarify, all of our panel 2 panelists at the moment, all panelists, I'll come with you shortly, but right now only panel 2, please. Thank you. So all of your presentations in this panel 2 have touched on the potential for policy measures to perpetuate inequities in the experiences of ocean litter, and perhaps have the potential to address them. I just wanted to give all the panelists an opportunity to reflect a little deeper on these questions of what are some of the potential governance responses to the ocean litter crisis and some of the equity issues that are related to those. I might actually start, if I may, by inviting Matt Perryman, Romilly Cumming, and perhaps Dr. Forelli as well to provide some more thoughts there, if you don't mind me coming to you first. Would you like to share any more reflections on these questions?
Yeah, sure, I'll kick that off. Thank you. I think what has become really clear is that we need meaningful action at every tier of governance, right through from community leadership, national, regional, and global. But obviously our research was conducted more at the national level, and so what we really advocate for, which has come up in panel 1, was place-based understandings of waste colonialism, because what that looks like to us here in Aotearoa is going to be really different from what waste colonialism looks like in Ghana or Vietnam, or anywhere else in the world. So once those experiences are better understood, different states and countries will be able to draw place-based solutions. And here in New Zealand, our governance system has obviously not been kind to Indigenous. I think it's a theme the world over, and implicit within that system are so many barriers to participation, which means that a Māori representation is really low. So pre-colonisation, Māori had established thriving secular economies, but under colonial rule, the economy was transformed to become intensive and extractive. And colonial institutions and systems are at the root of plastic pollution, and colonial methods of resource and waste management have been proved to be not only vastly ineffective, but incredibly harmful. So waste management and environmental care more broadly is an area where it's so obvious to us that we've got it wrong, and it makes total sense for Indigenous to lead in this space. But obviously we can't just elevate Indigenous in one area and not all areas, because health, social justice, education, they're all very deeply intertwined. So we're really advocating for decolonizing at every level, which means establishing equity-based political and economic systems and the recentering of Māori worldviews in governance. The irony is that under our founding document, the Treaty of Waitangi, Māori are guaranteed authority over decisions that affect them, particularly those that affect food sovereignty. But in practice, this isn't happening because of the inherent bias in governance institutions, which represent insurmountable barriers to many. So we think that in order to address plastics pollution in a way that is fair and equitable, we really need to establish holistic, relational, socio-ecological approaches to plastic pollution that not only integrates Indigenous worldviews, but is led by Indigenous people and obviously supported by Western science as well. And then, of course, we need to scale up these systems rapidly, because global institutes, even like the United Nations, remain inherently Eurocentric and often dismiss or misinterpret Indigenous relationships with lands and oceans. We've talked about those really special cultural relationships. So yeah, we absolutely support a global treaty to regulate plastic pollution, but cannot emphasize enough the need for Indigenous people's full and meaningful participation in these processes.
Thank you very much indeed, Romilly. I'll endeavour to come back to Matt and Trizia, but first I will just move to the other panellists to make sure I get around every contribution. Beth, we've just been picking up on some questions here around the global level of governance. So would you like to share some reflections on these questions, please?
Yeah, I want to address the second question in particular, because I'm concerned about the equity implications that may result from a governance patchwork. And in particular, the phenomenon of balloon effects. So balloon effects occur when tightening restrictions in one place squeeze the most harmful plastic production and consumption into areas of weaker regulation. And this is especially likely in the global plastics industry because the petrochemical industry is global and it sells products in a globalized market. We've already seen examples of this where regulations tighten for product quality standards or product design in the EU market, and companies like Johnson & Johnson improve their products in that market and then shift to sell the more disposable, more likely to enter the marine environment, more harmful products, and weaker jurisdictions such as in India and Southeast Asia. And so there is a real need for uniformity, ideally, but also capacity building between jurisdictions to know what's going to work and how can it be successfully implemented. So I'm also interested in a global treaty. It seems like the literature in general is split between we desperately need a global treaty and we can't get a global treaty soon enough, so we have to find other solutions. But I think it's important to keep in mind that if you're just focusing on where it's most feasible to most quickly get the tightest regulations, that you might result in a shift of harmful production and consumption that doesn't actually solve the problem. It just changes where the problem's most vivid effects are occurring in a certain moment.
Thank you very much, Beth. Keeping with the theme of this global ocean governance, Elisa, can I turn to you, please? And then I'll invite Jess and Trizia, I see you, so I'll go to you next. Thank you very much. Please, Elisa, your reflections.
Thank you. And yeah, I wish to offer an answer to what we can do in terms of proposed governance that will build on what Romilly and Beth just said, and which is, I think my suggestion would be that, integrating human rights standards across all the existing framework which we discussed, but also as soon as possible into the ongoing negotiations of future ones, be that the BBNJ, the new plastic treaty and so on, I think is really crucial. First of all, because it shows to governments that the integration of indigenous knowledge in a respectful way, the understanding of equity impacts, all of this is based on existing international obligations those countries already have, not just maybe the more open-ended ones that they have under international environmental agreements, such as the CBD or the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but I think tighter legal obligations that they have under relevant international human rights treaties, including the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but many other very basic ones like the Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And importantly, I think we could offer this work of integrating those human rights standards, the procedural one for real participation and co-development of solutions, but also joint assessment of the solutions that are proposed and jointly understanding what kind of equity impacts they might have. But also really from a substantive perspective to really understand the crucial objects of protection that can't be compromised. And so that's the substantive role of human rights, looking at the best interest of the child, at the interrelated human rights of indigenous peoples and others. And so really having that very, I think, systemic approach to how international human rights standards can help us think in a more integrated way in those international fora, including new international treaty making, and also making those processes themselves procedurally really open to that co-production of solutions.
Thank you very much indeed, Elisa. Trizia, please.
Kia ora, thank you, and congratulations to my students, Matt and Romilly, great job. I'd like to add to that, in response to Dr. Mendelhall's comment and also in support of Dr. Mogara's comments around responses, in order to ensure that we're not seeing regrettable alternatives and solutions in the face of bans, for example. And there's a lot of instruments available out there, policy instruments, financial instruments, in order to ensure that corporates are taking responsibility for the full life of the products that they produce, and that they meet those human rights responsibilities that Eliza has so articulately laid out for us here today. What we need, I think, is, we need those sustainable financial mechanisms to ensure equity between those who have and those who have not, in terms of helping them to prevent the harmful impacts of the full life cycle of plastics, but also speaking really carefully about a toxic-free economy where plastics are concerned, because we know that those toxics again disproportionately affect those who are most reliant on plastics or on food, for their well-being. Those are largely Indigenous, marginalised coastal communities, as we've discussed. We've got 2 resolutions on the table before us at this moment, moving into UNEA 5.2 in February. One of those is the Rwanda-Peru draft resolution, and the other one is Japan's resolution. I'm so excited by the Rwanda-Peru draft resolution because it speaks loud and clear to the sorts of things that we're looking at here to avoid those disproportional impacts of plastics across the globe. Those include the financial and scientific mechanisms required. It speaks to the misinformation that Dr. Orelanis, the rapporteur on toxics and human rights, we're talking about. There's a lot of misinformation around, and Dr. Vandenberg spoke to us about this as well as part of being responsible for the full life cycle of plastics and the correct information about the science, access to best practice. It's all talked about in this Rwanda-Peru draft resolution. The other things that we need in terms of equity is around monitoring and reporting and access to that for those who are limited in terms of their resources and capacity in developing countries. So there are some exciting things on the table for us, and that both those resolutions are looking for an intergovernmental negotiating committee, which will then move to the mandate for a global treaty. So I'm excited about the Rwanda-Peru draft resolution in terms of what we're talking about here today. Kia ora.
Thank you very much indeed, Tricia. And now, Jess, please, if you'd just like to share, if I can beg your indulgence, just a minute, please, so that we can move on to our final panel and hear from everybody. Thank you. Please, Jess.
I mean, I guess I would just make it, I think, everyone's touched on really valuable things that we need to consider when thinking of a future agreement and what that would look like. I think for me, focusing on industry is, whether this happens within a plastics agreement or something beyond that, just there needs to be greater accountability for corporations working in this space, because they are working on the periphery. So, I mean, in some contexts, it is working within actual national legislation, but there's also opportunities for co-option and working in the market space. And I think this is an area for concern. And also the fact that, it's this thing that we can roll out these really ambitious goals, but there's also, it's just as easy to silently abandon those goals on the side. So having greater accountability for those efforts that are happening in industry.
Thank you so much, Jess. That really puts us nicely into our third and final panel to close us in this last 10 minutes of our event today. In this panel, I'd like to invite all panelists from both 1 and 2 to please join us with your videos on if you'd like. And our discussion question for this section is, what can be done to ensure that responses to the ocean litter crisis produce equitable outcomes through the decade? So what would you like to see in the ocean decade to really address the clean ocean in an equitable way? I'd love to come to each of you in turn. I suggest going in the order from panel 1 to 2, which would mean starting with JJ, if that's all right, JJ. And if I could please ask you to keep it just to 1 minute if possible, so that we can hear from everyone as we have time. I'm sorry we don't have more time today. So please, JJ, would you like to share your final reflections for today on this question?
Thank you very much, Harriet. I think the lesson learned from the last COP26 was clear. If we are aiming to decarbonize the world in the future, 10 years from now, I think we can plead also to displastify human society in somehow. Of course, that's too ambitious, but if we have the political will in some nation, at least to take away single-use plastics and provide job exit and alternative to the most exposed community, I think we can talk about equity in some part of the world. For those developing nations, small islands, that are really being the recipient of all this ecological footprint. I think we can do it. I think there is hope. I am sometimes idealist, but I think thinking about the plastifying societies at some level in the future might be a pathway. That's my own perception, and I just want to share with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, JJ. Elaine, please.
All right, well, thank you to JJ as well. And to the previous discussion, I was really encouraged about this idea of the co-solutions and making sure that we broaden this framework, because I think that's absolutely essential. And that will achieve one of our goals for bringing more individuals to the table. I think one of the things that we've been working on is that the voice from the disadvantaged populations or underserved populations or indigenous voices have not been there at the table. So I think these things are extremely encouraging. I like the idea of looking at components that have a big impact on the overall part and using the science to direct us in that. But that's a bit complex. So I like the idea of making sure that our science is right when we pick that low-hanging fruit. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Elaine, and thank you everyone for keeping such great time. Ivy, please.
Yeah, so I think for me, what can be done to translate whatever we are doing here to an equitable outcome out there is to really look at it from a bottom-up approach, especially in developing countries like Ghana. I think people are suffering and they don't know what to do because they are not empowered enough to talk and let the government know how they are suffering. They are scared that who am I to go and ask the government to do ABC? Because mind you, developed areas in Ghana get the best of service when it comes to waste management. Why can't other areas get it? Because they are not high income communities, and so they cannot ask and approach and empowering people to ask for the right things to be done is the way to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivy. Beth, please, your thoughts.
I think we need to focus on regulating production in terms of product design and the types of plastics that we're using. And I think we need to complement global regulatory efforts with trade controls at the national level. The overall goal here would be preventing industry from saying one thing and doing another on the global scale. In my opinion, a result of allowing industry to take the lead and put all the focus on waste management and disposal and consumption in terms of consumer choices will lead to some of the most inequitable outcomes.
Thank you, Beth. What a great transition to Jess as well. Please.
I mean, I would echo a lot of what Beth was just saying. I think one of my biggest questions is why is industry such a major stakeholder at the decision-making table? We should be focused, what Ivy said too, we need to integrate more of a bottom-up approach and allow the stakeholders who are most impacted by this problem to have a voice at the table. So we need to rethink those ratios of whose voice is translating into governance.
Thank you so much, Jess. Eliza, please.
Yeah, so I think I have two ideas for the role of the Ocean Science Decade in particular to support all the suggestions made so far. I think the first is bringing together relevant research similar to what this webinar has done so that we can identify those priorities that among the research gaps we have about ocean plastics and its impacts so that we determine priorities that will benefit the most vulnerable communities and groups out there. And together also assess what impacts the proposed solutions may have really across the marine and social sciences, but crucially also through transdisciplinary ocean research. And so bringing together different knowledge systems, notably indigenous knowledge, but many other knowledge systems that are available there. And through that, I think, setting an example of really integrated evidence base that can then be brought to the attention of the different international fora we identified, but also really developing a model for that collaboration, that co-development of solutions that needs to start as early on as in the production of evidence to then play out in decision-making and policy-making and ideally implementation and enforcement.
Thank you so much, Eliza. If I could now turn to Matt and then Trizia for the final word after that. Please, Matt, would you like to share your reflections?
Sure, thank you. I totally agree with the industry regulation needs to be a priority for us. And I think also just the reprioritization of our ways of being towards caring for the environment and our communities more than profit really has to be the ethos that underlies a lot of this regulation. Just a few main points before passing to Tricia. Totally agreed that we need to have more Indigenous leadership and scientists at the decision-making tables and in policymaking. And we need to totally divest from fossil fuels and call on our governments to do that as the ones that have the current power to do such actions. And alongside that, we need to decolonize and redesign our waste management systems in order to support a non-toxic economy for plastics. We also need to invest in developing localized circular economies so that our communities can support themselves rather than relying on central or even local government to make appropriate local changes so that we can better deal with our present and upcoming challenges. The last point I just wanted to make was reiterating Tricia's point on how we have to make science, research, and academia a lot more accessible to non-scientists so that we have the information available and it's equitable in that way. Over to Tricia.
Oh, kia ora, Matt. Yeah, I guess just to reiterate around the science as well, and the human right to access to science and the disinformation and distortion of science that happens often. I do a lot of work also in the Pacific Islands and microplastics. We're very used to hearing that. That's not something that is universally understood by all people all the time. And in fact, there's no Indigenous word for obvious reasons for microplastics, for example, let alone recyclable, compostable, reusable and so on. So there are some real problems around those too. Yes, I also want to reiterate a safe, toxic, free and regenerative economy with Indigenous and marginalised people, those who are most disproportionately impacted by plastic pollution, broadly speaking, beyond marine litter, beyond marine pollution, need to be not only at the table, but I put in the notes there, but also making the table. It's not just enough just to call people on at the last minute and call that consultation. That's not consultation. We're seeing a lot of citizen science getting involved in this at the moment, which is really terrific. And I just wanted to say too, just also in response to, I think, Dr. Mendelhall's comment earlier around this very aware of that these regrettable substitutes and so forth or solutions, and that we need to start and strengthen approach through really robust national plastic pollution prevention plans where Indigenous communities and marginalised people are right there setting that table. Kia ora.
Thank you so much, Tricia. That concludes our third and final panel. Before I hand it over to my co-moderator, Jess Vandenberg, I'd just like to thank all of the panelists for an absolutely fantastic and eye-opening discussion today. It's been wonderful. I'd also like to thank Dr. Jess Vandenberg for her wonderful co-moderation and all of her work in bringing this event together. And now, Jess, I hand it over to you for the final thank yous and close.
Thank you so much, Harriet, and thank you again for co-chairing this event with me. It's been extremely insightful, and also thank you to all the panelists. I have so many thoughts now as I'm thinking through these issues. Like Alicia said, I think that this needs to be the first of many of these conversations, and we're hoping that this event is that. We're hoping to hold follow-up workshops so that we can continue this conversation and start to develop what a roadmap towards equitable solutions might look like. And we invite you all to reach out if you would like to further engage in this process. Here is everyone's contact details, and this invitation extends to, all the panelists are part of this process already, but anyone in the audience who is interested in the work that we're doing and has some thoughts or on maybe issues that we're not considering, we really want to hear from everyone so that we are really taking a holistic approach to thinking about equity issues. And again, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank the Nippon Foundation for supporting this work, and also the UN Ocean Decade for providing this platform to talk about these issues. So, and that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Big thanks also to Ali Long,
Thank
Constance
you,
McFarren, Holly Amos and Corinna Tsuka as well for the team. Thanks so much, everyone.
Absolutely.